the footage that has been broadcast by the Manchester Evening News, some of it heavily pixelated, but the context that the family wishes to provide is that if you watch closely the footage, that Fahir is immediately grabbed by the wrist, as can be seen on the CCTV. The male officer proceeds to grab Fahir by the neck, and it is alleged that he hits Fahir's head into the ticket machine, at which point the other son, Ahmad, asked the police officer to move his hand from Fahir's neck, as he was not resisting arrest. Ahmad and his mother, Shameem, were shocked at the unnecessary aggression and alleged violence shown from the start. There was no immediate attempt to speak to Fahir, to ask him to step aside, to caution him, or to simply say, "Can we speak to you for a second?" The family appreciates you have seen leaked footage with pixelation of the top of vital events as they unfold. However, this is what the context of what took place. When Ahmad asked the police officer to remove his neck hold, it is alleged by him and his mother and others that the male officer then proceeded to punch Ahmad twice in the side of his head, at which point Ahmad falls onto the ground. Mrs. Akhtar also falls to the ground as the officer pulls her and Ahmad down due to the fact that she was holding Ahmad from behind. The officer, whilst punching Ahmad, pushes her to the ground, and she looked up and saw the officer firing his taser at Ahmad, at which point she screamed, "They've killed my son," in Urdu. And as you can see from the CCTV, pandemonium breaks loose at that point. At this point, Mrs. Akhtar, seeing Fahir running towards the officer and saw that he is also tasered from behind and lands face first, at which point the officer falls down with him. Mrs. Akhtar then goes to Fahir and can be seen leaning over her son as he lies motionless on the ground. The taser that is used is a prohibited firearm and licensed by police officers to use, and it can emit up to 50,000 volts of electricity. At no point do you see on the video Fahir reaching for any officer's firearms, as is later claimed in the immediate press release from the GMP, nor is he in fact doing anything other than lying motionless face down. It is at this point, as the officer stands up, he proceeds to run and kick Fahir in the face. Mrs. Akhtar then tried to pull her son's head away, and as the officer then attempts to stamp on his head, as can be seen in the graphic video at this point, both brothers are compliant. Fahir is incapacitated. His brother is sat some distance behind on a seat with his hands on his head, with officers keeping him under control. The officer then proceeds to lift his foot up and appears to stamp down on Fahir's head. Mrs. Akhtar states that she attempted to pull her son's head away as she thought the officer could have killed her son at this point. She genuinely believed at this point that her son was dying, as he was limp and unresponsive due to being tasered. The male is alleged, as seen in the video, then kneels down, the male officer, kneels down on Fahir, placing his knee on his back whilst he is still limp, and then looks up straight at Mrs. Akhtar whilst he has his knee on Fahir's back and he is not moving. At this point, it is alleged that the male officer still has his taser drawn, then using his right hand, it is alleged, he strikes Mrs. Akhtar directly in the face using his taser as a weapon. At this point, Mrs. Akhtar never, prior to this or during that point, is presenting any threat to any police officer. At this point, Mrs. Akhtar screams. As she holds her face, she is terrified that she would now be subjected to the same violence as she alleges her son were. This is the bruising that Mrs. Akhtar had on her face. You'll get copies of this at the end of the press conference. But this is the bruising, some of which you can still see on Mrs. Akhtar's face today. She was left bleeding from below her eye. This is what Mrs. Akhtar alleged she was subjected to, and at no point did any officer approach Mrs. Akhtar to check on her well-being or her welfare. At no point did anybody seek to get medical assistance for Mrs. Akhtar, and as she screamed, as I state, she thought that she would now face the same violence as her two sons did.